Welcome to today's episode of Lost Worlds Uncovered, where we journey back to the most extraordinary period in Earth's atmospheric history. Imagine stepping outside your door and taking a deep breath. But instead of the familiar 21% oxygen we breathe today, your lungs fill with air containing 35% pure oxygen. Your body surges with energy you've never felt before. Colors seem more vivid. Your thoughts race faster, and you feel like you could run forever without getting tired. But as you look around this alien world, you realize the price of this supercharged atmosphere. Dragonflies the size of eagles patrol overhead, their massive wings casting shadows that could eclipse a grown person. In the distance, millipedes as long as school buses crawl through towering fern forests that stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Centipedes 6 feet long hunt through the undergrowth, while scorpions the size of large dogs scuttle across the landscape. This isn't science fiction. This was Earth 300 million years ago during the Late Carboniferous period, the one and only time in our planet's history when atmospheric oxygen reached these incredible levels. It was an era that would reshape the very foundations of life, create the coal deposits that fuel our modern world, and demonstrate just how dramatically atmospheric changes can transform an entire planet. How did our atmosphere become supercharged with oxygen? What allowed insects to grow to monstrous proportions? And what does this ancient world tell us about our planet's future? Today, we're diving deep into the most oxygen-rich period in Earth's history. Chapter 1. The world before superoxygen. Before we can understand how Earth's atmosphere became supercharged with 35% oxygen, we need to travel back to a world that would be utterly unrecognizable to modern eyes. Picture our planet 350 million years ago, at the dawn of the Carboniferous period. The continents you know today don't exist. Instead, massive landmasses drift slowly toward each other, destined to collide and form the supercontinent Pangaea over the next 50 million years. The geography of this ancient world was fundamentally different from anything we see today. Where modern North America sits, a vast tropical continent called Laurentia stretched across the equator. Europe and parts of Asia formed another landmass called Baltica, while the southern continents were united in the massive supercontinent of Gondwana. Between these landmasses lay shallow tropical seas that would play a crucial role in the atmospheric transformation to come. The climate is warm and humid across most of the globe, unlike anything in our modern experience. There are no ice caps at the poles, and tropical conditions extend far into what we would consider temperate regions today. The average global temperature is nearly 10 degrees Celsius warmer than today, creating a greenhouse world where lush vegetation can thrive almost everywhere. Most importantly for our story, there are no flowers, no grass, no birds, and no mammals. The air buzzes with primitive insects, while the first amphibians are just beginning to venture onto land from their aquatic homes. At the beginning of the Carboniferous period, Earth's atmosphere contained only about 20% oxygen, roughly the same levels we breathe today. But the composition was very different in other ways. Carbon dioxide levels were dramatically higher, perhaps 4 to 16 times modern concentrations, creating the intense greenhouse effect that kept the planet warm and humid. Volcanic activity across the globe pumped massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, maintaining a delicate balance that had persisted for millions of years. The landscape itself tells a story of a world in transition. The first forests had begun to appear during the preceding Devonian period, but these were unlike anything we would recognize as forests today. Instead of towering oaks or majestic pines, the early Carboniferous landscape was dominated by strange, primitive plants that looked more like giant ferns and oversized mosses than modern trees. But this balance was about to be shattered by the most dramatic biological innovation in Earth's history since the evolution of photosynthesis itself. Plants were about to evolve the ability to produce lignin, a tough, woody substance that would allow them to grow taller than ever before, and, crucially, would prove nearly impossible for contemporary organisms to decompose. The key players in our story weren't animals or bacteria, but plants. Lignin is essentially nature's plastic, a tough, durable molecule that gives wood its strength and rigidity. Before lignin, plants were limited to relatively small sizes because they lacked the structural support to grow tall. They could spread horizontally across the ground, but reaching toward the sky required materials engineering that didn't yet exist in the plant kingdom. With lignin, everything changed. Plants could now build woody stems and trunks, reaching skyward in an endless competition for sunlight. The first true forest began to emerge, dominated by strange plants that would look alien to modern eyes. These weren't the familiar oak trees or pine forests we know today. Instead, towering scale trees called lepidodendron rose 150 feet into the air, their surfaces covered in diamond-shaped scale patterns that gave them their name. These early giants were marvels of biological engineering. Lepidodendron trees grew from massive underground root systems that spread horizontally through the swampy soils of the Carboniferous landscape. But unlike modern trees, their root systems were surprisingly shallow, making them vulnerable to toppling during storms. Their trunks were hollow in the center, filled with soft tissue that provided structural support when the trees were young, but left them prone to collapse as they aged. Alongside these giants grew calamites, primitive relatives of modern horsetails that could reach heights of 60 feet. These plants looked like enormous bamboo stalks, with segmented stems and whorls of needle-like leaves at each joint. Tree ferns spread their massive fronds across the forest canopy, creating a green ceiling that filtered the intense tropical sunlight. Early seed plants called chordates formed dense growths throughout the prehistoric landscape, their strap-like leaves reaching lengths of over a meter. These forests were unlike anything Earth had ever seen, vast, continuous expanses of vegetation that stretched from the equator nearly to the poles. In some regions, the forest canopy was so dense that little sunlight reached the ground, creating a twilight world beneath the towering trees. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves, branches, and entire tree trunks that had toppled in storms or reached the end of their natural lifespans. As these early forests spread across the continents, they began to fundamentally alter Earth's atmosphere through the simple process of photosynthesis. Each day, billions of plants pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and released oxygen as a waste product. This process had been occurring for hundreds of millions of years, but never on the scale that was now beginning to unfold. Under normal circumstances, this oxygen would be consumed by decomposing plant matter when organisms died and bacteria broke down their tissues. The carbon cycle would remain in rough balance. Carbon removed from the atmosphere by living plants would be returned when they died and decomposed. But something extraordinary was about to happen that would break this natural cycle and send atmospheric oxygen soaring to levels never seen before or since. The plants had evolved a secret weapon, lignin, but the organisms needed to break it down simply did not exist yet. For the first time in Earth's history, plants had developed a substance that was virtually indestructible by the bacteria and fungi of the era. The stage was set for the most dramatic atmospheric transformation in Earth's history, one that would create giants and reshape the very air we breathe. Chapter 2. The Evolution of Nature's Plastic. To understand how Earth's atmosphere became supercharged with oxygen, we need to dive deep into the molecular revolution that started it all, the evolution of lignin. This remarkable compound would prove to be one of the most consequential innovations in the history of life on Earth, with effects that continue to shape our world today. The story of lignin is the story of how plants accidentally created the most oxygen-rich atmosphere in Earth's history. Lignin is essentially nature's answer to the engineering challenge of building tall structures. Picture a skyscraper made entirely of cellulose, the soft, fibrous material that makes up most plant tissue. Without some kind of internal framework, that building would collapse under its own weight the moment it tried to reach any significant height. Plants faced exactly this problem as they competed for sunlight in Earth's early forests. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity, but revolutionary in its consequences. Plants began producing lignin, a complex polymer made up of interconnected aromatic compounds that create an incredibly strong, rigid matrix within plant tissues. Unlike cellulose, which is relatively soft and easily digestible, lignin forms tough, cross-linked networks that are extraordinarily resistant to breakdown. The chemical structure of lignin is unlike anything else in the natural world. It is built from phenolic compounds, the same family of molecules that gives wine its tannins, and wood its distinctive smell when burned. But while individual phenolic compounds are relatively simple, lignin connects them into vast three-dimensional networks that can contain millions of individual molecules all linked together in an almost indestructible web. When lignin is incorporated into plant cell walls, it creates what we recognize as wood, a material so strong that humans have used it as a primary building material for thousands of years. But 350 million years ago, when plants first began mass-producing lignin, the natural world had never encountered anything quite like it. It was as if plants had suddenly begun manufacturing a completely alien material. The first forests to extensively use lignin were dominated by massive-scale trees that could grow to heights rivaling modern redwoods. These lepidodendron forests covered vast areas of the continents, creating the first truly three-dimensional ecosystems on land. Their thick, lignin-rich bark formed protective armor around their trunks, while their massive root systems, shallow but extensive, allowed them to anchor themselves in the swampy soils that covered much of the Carboniferous landscape. The evolutionary advantages of lignin were immediately apparent. Plants that could produce this wonder material could grow taller than their competitors, gaining access to more sunlight and dominating their environments. But lignin provided more than just structural support. It also offered protection against herbivores and environmental stresses. The tough, woody tissue was difficult for animals to digest and provided excellent defense against drought, cold, and physical damage. But here's where the story takes a crucial turn that would reshape the entire planet. When these massive trees reached the end of their lives and toppled over, something unprecedented happened. They didn't decompose. The bacteria and fungi that had evolved to break down the soft tissues of earlier plants were completely unable to digest lignin. It was as if nature had suddenly started producing plastic trees. The biochemical reason for this was simple but profound. Lignin's complex three-dimensional structure and aromatic chemical bonds made it incredibly resistant to the enzymes that decomposer organisms use to break down other plant materials. Cellulose, despite being tough, has a relatively simple structure that many organisms had learned to attack. But lignin was different. Its cross-linked network of aromatic compounds created a molecular fortress that contemporary decomposers simply couldn't breach. Day after day, year after year, for millions of years, dead trees simply accumulated where they fell. Entire forests would topple during storms, and the fallen trunks would lie there indefinitely, slowly being buried by sediments and new vegetation growing on top of them. The carbon that had been pulled from the atmosphere to build these trees remained locked away in their preserved tissues instead of returning to the air through decomposition. This created a massive imbalance in Earth's carbon cycle that had never occurred before in the planet's history. Plants continued to pull CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, releasing oxygen as a waste product. But without decomposition to return that carbon to the atmosphere, the process became essentially one-way. Carbon dioxide levels began to plummet while oxygen levels soared. The scale of this process was staggering beyond comprehension. Biochemist Nick Lane has calculated that during the height of the Carboniferous period, coal formation was occurring at rates 600 times higher than normal. We be talking about the burial of organic matter on a scale that has never been repeated in Earth's history. The vast coal deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution and continue to provide energy today are almost entirely the product of this unique 60 million year period when dead plants simply couldn't rot. The lignin revolution had another crucial consequence that would prove equally important for our story. The massive burial of carbon-rich plant matter meant that unprecedented amounts of oxygen were accumulating in the atmosphere. Starting from the normal levels of around 20% that characterized the early Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen began a steady climb that would eventually peak at an extraordinary 35%. This wasn't a gradual, steady process. Geological evidence suggests that oxygen levels fluctuated dramatically throughout the Carboniferous period, sometimes reaching peaks even higher than 35% before falling back down. The exact mechanisms driving these fluctuations are still being studied by scientists, but they were likely related to the complex interactions between climate, sea level changes, and the varying rates of forest burial in different regions of the world. The transformation of Earth's atmosphere through lignin production represents one of the most dramatic examples of how biological innovations can have planet-wide consequences. A single evolutionary development, the ability to produce a tough, woody polymer, ended up reshaping the entire composition of Earth's atmosphere and setting the stage for evolutionary experiments that would never be possible under normal atmospheric conditions. The world was about to become a very different place. With oxygen levels nearly twice as high as today, the stage was set for some of the most dramatic evolutionary changes in Earth's history. But first, life had to adapt to this hypercharged atmosphere, and the results would be both magnificent and terrifying. The era of giants was about to begin. Chapter 3. When the air became fire. Living in a world with 35% atmospheric oxygen wasn't just a matter of breathing easier. It fundamentally changed the very nature of existence on Earth. To understand why, you need to realize that oxygen isn't just the gas that keeps us alive. It's also one of the most reactive elements on the planet. Increase its concentration dramatically, and you create an environment unlike anything in Earth's modern history, where fire becomes a dominant force shaping every aspect of life. The most immediate and dramatic effect of hypercharged oxygen levels was the transformation of fire itself. In our modern atmosphere, with its 21% oxygen content, fires can be dangerous, but are generally predictable. Wood needs to be fairly dry to burn readily. Fires typically spread at manageable rates, and firefighters can usually control blazes with water and fire retardant chemicals. But bump oxygen levels up to 35%, and fire becomes an entirely different beast. A force of nature so powerful it reshapes entire continents. Scientists have calculated that with Carboniferous oxygen levels, even waterlogged wood would ignite and burn readily. The elevated oxygen concentration meant that virtually any organic material could serve as fuel, and once fires started, they burned with an intensity that defies modern experience. Forest fires wouldn't just spread from tree to tree. They would explode across the landscape, consuming everything in their path with terrifying speed and creating their own weather systems. The evidence for this transformation is written in the geological record in the form of widespread charcoal deposits from the Carboniferous period. These aren't just scattered fire remnants representing occasional blazes. They represent continent-spanning wildfires that regularly swept across the planet with a frequency and intensity that has no modern parallel. Some charcoal layers extend across thousands of square kilometers, indicating single fire events that burned areas larger than entire modern countries. Imagine standing in one of these ancient forests as a fire approached. The supercharged atmosphere would cause flames to burn so hot and fast that entire forests could be consumed in hours, rather than days or weeks. Trees wouldn't just catch fire, they would essentially explode as the elevated oxygen levels turned every piece of vegetation into highly combustible fuel. The fires would create their own weather, generating massive convection currents that could lift burning debris high into the atmosphere and spread flames across rivers and other barriers that would normally stop fires. These weren't just bigger versions of modern forest fires. They were fundamentally different phenomena that followed different rules. In the oxygen-rich carboniferous atmosphere, fires could burn underground through layers of accumulated organic matter, smoldering for months or even years before erupting to the surface in massive firestorms. They could cross rivers and wetlands that would stop modern fires completely, and they burned so hot that they could consume green, living vegetation that would normally be fire-resistant due to its high water content. The frequency of these mega fires was equally staggering. Rather than occurring every few decades or centuries like modern forest fires, carboniferous firestorms may have swept across many regions every few years. The combination of abundant fuel from accumulated dead vegetation and the fire-prone atmosphere created conditions where fires were not just common, but essentially inevitable. Lightning strikes, volcanic activity, or even spontaneous combustion could trigger blazes that would consume millions of acres. But perhaps even more remarkable than the fires themselves was how life adapted to this pyromaniac's paradise. Rather than being destroyed by the constant threat of fire, carboniferous ecosystems evolved to not just survive, but thrive in this fire-dominated world. Plants evolved thick, fire-resistant bark that could protect their vital tissues from all but the most intense fires. Some species developed the ability to regenerate rapidly from underground root systems after fires passed through, essentially treating regular burning as a normal part of their life cycle. Even more remarkably, some carboniferous plants actually became dependent on fire for reproduction. These species evolved seeds that required the intense heat of fires to germinate properly, ensuring that new generations would emerge from the ashes of burned forests. This fire-dependent reproduction strategy allowed these plants to quickly colonize areas cleared by fires, giving them a competitive advantage in the fire-dominated landscapes of the time. The animals of the carboniferous world also had to develop extraordinary adaptations to deal with the constant threat of fire. Many species evolved sophisticated behaviors that allowed them to detect and escape approaching fires. Some arthropods developed the ability to survive underground during fire events, burrowing deep into soil or hiding in cave systems until the danger passed. Others evolved rapid reproduction strategies that allowed populations to recover quickly after fires swept through their habitats. The frequent fires also served a crucial role in the global oxygen cycle that often goes unrecognized. While the burial of lignin-rich plant matter was pumping oxygen into the atmosphere at unprecedented rates, these massive wildfires provided a natural release valve that prevented oxygen levels from climbing even higher. When plants burned, their carbon combined with atmospheric oxygen to form carbon dioxide, helping to moderate what could otherwise have been a runaway increase in oxygen concentration. Without this natural burning process, atmospheric oxygen could theoretically have continued climbing indefinitely, with potentially catastrophic consequences. At oxygen levels much above 35%, the entire planet might have become essentially uninhabitable due to the constant threat of spontaneous combustion. Even in the carboniferous world, with its elevated fire risk, complex ecosystems managed to thrive because life adapted to this new reality over millions of years. The psychological impact of living with constant fire would have been profound for any creatures capable of understanding the threat. The distant smell of smoke could signal an approaching wall of flames moving faster than anything could run. The stress of constant vigilance would have been a powerful evolutionary pressure, driving innovations in sensory systems, escape behaviors, and survival strategies that we can only imagine. Yet despite the constant threat, or perhaps because of it, the Carboniferous world supported more diverse and spectacular life than had ever existed on land. The fire-dominated landscapes created a complex mosaic of habitats, recently burned areas rich in nutrients, recovering forests with young vegetation, and mature stands waiting for the next fire cycle that supported incredible biological diversity. Fire was both destroyer and creator in the Carboniferous world, shaping ecosystems and driving evolution in ways that would be impossible in our modern atmosphere. But as we'll see, this fire-dominated world was setting the stage for even more spectacular evolutionary innovations, the rise of giants that would rule this hypercharged planet. Chapter 4: Rise of the Aerial Giants. In the oxygen-saturated skies of the Carboniferous world, evolution was about to perform one of its most spectacular experiments. The familiar insects we know today, small, delicate creatures that we barely notice as they go about their lives, were about to transform into monsters that would dominate the airways like nothing before or since. The hypercharged atmosphere was about to give birth to aerial predators that would make modern birds of prey look tiny by comparison. The star of this transformation was Meganeura, a dragonfly-like creature that would become the poster child for Carboniferous gigantism and one of the most iconic prehistoric animals ever discovered. When the first Meganeura fossils were discovered in the coal deposits of Commentry, France, in 1880, paleontologists could hardly believe what they were seeing. The wingspan measurements seemed impossible, over 70 centimeters from tip to tip, making these creatures larger than many modern birds and easily the largest flying insects in Earth's history. To put this extraordinary size in perspective, imagine a dragonfly with the wingspan of a bald eagle patrolling the skies above you. But Meganeura wasn't just a scaled-up version of modern dragonflies. It was a perfectly engineered flying predator optimized for the unique atmospheric conditions of its time. Every aspect of its anatomy was adapted for life in the oxygen-rich Carboniferous atmosphere, from its massive compound eyes to its reinforced wing structure. The structure of Meganeura's wings was a masterpiece of natural engineering that puts modern aircraft design to shame. Unlike the delicate, transparent wings of modern dragonflies, Meganeura's wings were reinforced with dense networks of veins and cross braces that could withstand the enormous stresses of supporting its substantial body weight during flight. The wing membranes themselves were thicker and stronger than those of contemporary insects, able to generate the massive amounts of lift needed to keep a 100 to 150-gram flying predator airborne. Engineering analyses conducted by modern scientists suggest that Meganeura's flight capabilities were truly extraordinary. Despite its large size, it was probably capable of the same kind of aerial acrobatics that make modern dragonflies such effective predators: sudden stops, sharp turns, and rapid acceleration that would be impossible for vertebrate flyers of similar size. Its massive flight muscles, powered by the oxygen-rich atmosphere, could generate the energy needed for sustained high-speed flight and complex maneuvering. The hunting strategies of Meganeura were likely similar to those of modern hawk or dragonflies, but scaled up to accommodate much larger prey. Its enlarged compound eyes, proportionally larger than those of modern dragonflies, gave it exceptional vision for spotting prey from great distances. These eyes contained thousands of individual lenses, each capable of detecting movement and changes in light intensity with incredible precision. Meganeura had spines on its legs that functioned as aerial traps, allowing it to snatch flying insects out of the air with devastating efficiency. Its powerful mandibles could crush the exoskeletons of other arthropods, making it a formidable predator capable of taking down insects that would themselves be considered giants by modern standards. Some scientists speculate that the largest specimens might even have been capable of catching and eating small vertebrates like early amphibians and reptiles. But Meganeura wasn't alone in the Carboniferous skies. It shared the airways with an entire ecosystem of giant flying insects that created the most diverse and spectacular aerial fauna in Earth's history. Meganeuropsis, an even larger relative that appeared later in the Permian period, achieved wingspans of up to 75 centimeters and may have been capable of taking down vertebrate prey on a regular basis. The diversity of giant flying insects during this period was staggering. Enormous mayflies with multiple pairs of wings achieved impressive sizes, creating a complex aerial ecosystem of predators and prey. Some primitive flying insects had 6 wings instead of the 4 that characterize modern flying insects, giving them unique flight capabilities that have never been duplicated. What made this aerial ecosystem even more remarkable was the complete absence of flying vertebrates. Birds wouldn't evolve for another 150 million years. Pterosaurs were still 50 million years in the future, and even gliding vertebrates were extremely rare. The skies belonged entirely to insects, and they took full advantage of this evolutionary opportunity to explore forms and sizes that would be impossible once vertebrate competitors appeared. The key to understanding how these giants could exist lies in the unique respiratory system of insects and how it interacts with atmospheric oxygen levels. Unlike vertebrates, which use lungs to actively pump air into their bodies and rely on blood to transport oxygen to their tissues, insects breathe through a network of tubes called trachea that deliver oxygen directly to their cells through passive diffusion. This system works brilliantly for small insects, but becomes increasingly inefficient as body size increases. The oxygen simply can't diffuse fast enough to support large bodies. In our modern 21% oxygen atmosphere, this constraint severely limits insect size. The largest modern insects, like the giant wettas of New Zealand or the biggest beetles, are already pushing the limits of what their respiratory systems can support. But in the 35% oxygen environment of the Carboniferous period, this limitation was effectively removed. The higher concentration gradient allowed oxygen to diffuse much more efficiently through insect respiratory systems, enabling them to support body sizes that would be physiologically impossible today. The elevated oxygen levels didn't just make larger insects possible, they made them inevitable as natural selection favored individuals that could take advantage of the improved respiratory efficiency. The success of these aerial giants had cascading effects throughout Carboniferous ecosystems. Their presence meant that other insects had to evolve new strategies to avoid predation, leading to an evolutionary arms race that drove innovation in flight speed, agility, camouflage, and defensive behaviors. Some insects grew larger to better defend themselves against aerial predators, while others became faster or more maneuverable. The dominance of giant flying insects also influenced the evolution of early vertebrates in profound ways. Amphibians and early reptiles had to contend with aerial predators unlike anything that exists today, flying hunters capable of snatching them from the ground or attacking them while they were vulnerable. This pressure drove the evolution of new defensive behaviors, protective coloration, and habitat preferences that helped vertebrates avoid becoming prey. But as spectacular as the aerial giants were, they represented only one facet of Carboniferous gigantism. On the ground, an even more diverse array of supersized arthropods was evolving, including creatures that would challenge our very conception of what an insect could become. The stage was set for the evolution of ground-dwelling monsters that would make Meganeura look small by comparison. Chapter 5. Monsters on the Ground. While the skies of the Carboniferous world belonged to giant dragonflies, the ground was home to creatures even more extraordinary, arthropods so massive they challenge our understanding of what is possible for invertebrate life. In the oxygen-rich atmosphere of this ancient world, evolution pushed the boundaries of arthropod design, to create monsters that would give even the bravest modern explorer nightmares. The undisputed champion of Carboniferous gigantism was Arthropleura, a millipede-like creature that achieved sizes so massive they defy belief. Based on fossilized remains found in Scotland, Germany, and North America, the largest specimens reached lengths of 2.6 meters over 8 feet long and widths of up to 50 centimeters, making them longer than most modern cars and easily the largest arthropods ever to walk the earth. To understand just how extraordinary Arthropleura was, you need to picture a creature with the basic body plan of a millipede, but scaled up to monstrous proportions. Its segmented body was protected by thick, armored plates that extended like overlapping shields along its back and sides. Each segment carried a pair of powerful legs, giving the largest specimen 60 legs working in coordinated waves to propel their massive bulk through the Carboniferous forests with surprising grace and efficiency. The engineering challenges of building and operating a body this size were enormous. Arthropleura's exoskeleton had to be incredibly strong to support its weight while remaining light enough to allow movement. The creature solved this problem through a combination of advanced biomaterials and ingenious structural design. Its armor plates were made of chitin reinforced with calcium carbonate, creating a composite material that was both lightweight and incredibly strong. Despite their intimidating size and armored appearance, Arthropleura were likely herbivores, using their powerful mandibles to process the tough plant matter that dominated their environment. Their massive size was probably an adaptation to this challenging diet. Larger guts could house the complex bacterial communities needed to break down cellulose and lignin, while their bulk allowed them to process enormous quantities of low-quality plant material. The digestive system of Arthropleura must have been a marvel of biological engineering. Processing the lignin-rich plants of the Carboniferous period required specialized gut bacteria and enormous digestive chambers. The creature's segmented body plan was perfectly suited for this, with multiple digestive compartments that could slowly break down tough plant fibers over extended periods. But Arthropleura wasn't the only ground-dwelling giant terrorizing the Carboniferous landscape. The period also produced Pulmonoscorpius, a massive scorpion that grew to lengths of over a meter, about the size of a large dog. Unlike modern scorpions, which are relatively small and reclusive, Pulmonoscorpius was a dominant predator in aquatic and semi-aquatic environments throughout what is now Scotland and northern England. The anatomy of Pulmonoscorpius suggests it was a master of both mechanical and chemical warfare. Its massive pincers could crush and tear apart prey with devastating force, while its enlarged tail carried a potent venom delivery system. The size of its claws relative to its tail suggests that Pulmonoscorpius relied more on mechanical crushing than venomous injection, using its powerful pincers to overwhelm prey before delivering a killing sting. Biologists speculate that Pulmonoscorpius may have hunted early tetrapods and fish in the shallow waters and swamps that characterized much of the Carboniferous landscape. Its large size would have made it a formidable predator, capable of taking down animals much larger than the typical arthropod prey that modern scorpions hunt. Perhaps even more terrifying were the giant centipedes that scuttled through the underbrush of Carboniferous forests. These creatures, some reaching lengths of 6 feet or more, were active predators with venomous bites capable of taking down substantial prey. Unlike the largely herbivorous Arthropleura, these centipedes were pure predators, their segmented bodies optimized for speed and striking power. The giant centipedes of the Carboniferous period possessed incredibly sophisticated hunting equipment. Their first pair of legs had evolved into massive venom-injecting claws called forcipules, which they could use to grab and poison prey. Their bodies were streamlined for rapid movement, allowing them to chase down other arthropods and even small vertebrates with lethal efficiency. The diversity of giant arthropods during the Carboniferous period was truly staggering. massive cockroaches scurried across the forest floor, some species reaching lengths of several inches giants compared to their modern descendants, but still dwarfed by their arthropod neighbors. These early cockroaches were often heavily armored and possessed powerful mandibles for processing the tough plant material that littered the forest floor. Enormous spiders built webs between the towering scale trees, creating three-dimensional trap systems that could catch flying insects of unprecedented size. Some of these arachnids may have grown large enough to hunt small vertebrates, using their size and strength to overwhelm prey that modern spiders couldn't dream of attacking. Primitive relatives of modern crickets and grasshoppers achieved sizes that would make them formidable predators rather than the mostly harmless creatures we know today. Some of these early orthopterans developed powerful jumping legs that could launch their massive bodies several meters through the air, allowing them to escape predators or pounce on prey with devastating impact. What made all of this gigantism possible was the unique combination of environmental factors that characterized the Carboniferous world. The elevated oxygen levels were crucial, but they weren't the only factor enabling arthropod gigantism. The warm, humid climate created ideal conditions for arthropod physiology, allowing these cold-blooded creatures to remain active year-round rather than being forced into seasonal dormancy. The absence of large vertebrate predators was particularly important for ground-dwelling giants. In our modern world, a creature the size of Arthropleura would be extremely vulnerable to attack from mammals, birds, or large reptiles. But in the Carboniferous world, the only threats came from other arthropods, and growing larger was often an effective defense against most invertebrate predators. The abundance of plant matter also played a crucial role in supporting these giants. The massive forests of the Carboniferous period produced enormous amounts of organic matter, creating food webs capable of supporting large-bodied arthropods. Dead plant material accumulated in thick layers on the forest floor, providing habitat and food for countless species of decomposer arthropods, which in turn supported the predators that fed on them. Living in this world of giants would have been a surreal and terrifying experience. Imagine walking through a Carboniferous forest and hearing the thunderous footsteps of an approaching Arthropleura, its 8-foot length allowing it to push through vegetation that would stop smaller animals completely. Picture stepping over centipedes longer than baseball bats, their segment bodies coiled and ready to strike with lightning speed. The ecological interactions between these giants must have been incredibly complex. Predator-prey relationships involved creatures of sizes that have no modern equivalent, while competition for resources took place on scales that dwarf anything in today's arthropod communities. The Carboniferous world was truly the age of arthropods, a time when invertebrates ruled the land with an authority they would never achieve again. Chapter 6. The Underwater Titans. While giant insects ruled the land and air of the Carboniferous world, the warm, oxygen-rich waters that covered much of the planet's surface harbored their own collection of titans. In the swamps, rivers, and shallow seas of this ancient world, arthropods pushed the boundaries of size and predatory efficiency to create some of the most formidable aquatic hunters in Earth's history, creatures that would make modern marine predators seem tame by comparison. The warm, humid climate of the Carboniferous period created vast wetland systems unlike anything that exists today. These weren't just small ponds or marshes scattered across the landscape. They were continent-spanning networks of interconnected waterways, swamps, and shallow seas that provided perfect conditions for aquatic giants to evolve and thrive. The sea level was higher than today, and much of what we now consider dry land was covered by warm, shallow water, perfect for large arthropod predators. In these waters lurked eurypterids, commonly known as sea scorpions, which had been perfecting the art of aquatic predation for millions of years before the Carboniferous period began. But the unique conditions of this era, elevated oxygen levels, warm temperatures, and abundant prey, allowed them to reach truly spectacular sizes that dwarfed their earlier relatives. Some Eurypterid species achieve lengths of over 2 meters, making them larger than most modern sharks and easily the most formidable predators in Carboniferous waters. These weren't just scaled-up versions of modern arthropods. They were perfectly engineered killing machines, adapted for life in the oxygen-rich waters of their time. The anatomy of these aquatic giants was perfectly suited for their role as apex predators. Their flattened, streamlined bodies and powerful swimming appendages made them incredibly efficient swimmers, capable of pursuing prey across long distances or lying in ambush in shallow water. Their massive grasping claws, some over a meter in length, could seize and crush prey with devastating force, while their compound eyes, enlarged to take advantage of the clear waters of Carboniferous wetlands, gave them exceptional vision for hunting in both bright and dim conditions. The largest Eurypterids possessed a sophisticated array of sensory equipment that made them nearly perfect aquatic predators. Their compound eyes were among the largest of any arthropod, with some specimens having eyes over 20 centimeters in diameter. These massive visual organs contain thousands of individual lenses, each capable of detecting movement, changes in light intensity, and even polarized light patterns that could reveal hidden prey. The hunting strategies of these aquatic giants were remarkably sophisticated for arthropods. Unlike modern arthropods, which are generally limited to relatively simple predatory behaviors, the largest Eurypterids appear to have been capable of complex hunting strategies that rivaled those of modern vertebrate predators. They could ambush prey from concealment among aquatic vegetation, pursue fleeing victims across long distances using their powerful swimming abilities, or even work together in coordinated attacks on particularly large targets. But the Eurypterids weren't the only aquatic giants terrorizing Carboniferous waterways. The period also saw the evolution of massive aquatic relatives of modern horseshoe crabs, some reaching sizes that would make them among the largest arthropods of any environment. These creatures combined the armored protection of their terrestrial relatives with specialized adaptations for life in the warm, shallow seas that covered much of the Carboniferous landscape. These giant horseshoe crab relatives possessed massive, dome-shaped carapaces that could reach over a meter in diameter, providing protection while allowing them to plow through bottom sediments in search of prey. Their powerful limbs were equipped with crushing claws and grinding surfaces that could process everything from mollusks to other arthropods with devastating efficiency. Perhaps even more remarkable were the giant aquatic relatives of modern dragonfly nymphs that evolved during this period. Today, dragonfly larvae are small, predatory insects that hunt other aquatic invertebrates in ponds and streams, rarely exceeding a few centimeters in length. But in the Carboniferous period, some species grew to enormous sizes, becoming apex predators in freshwater environments with body lengths measured in feet rather than inches. These aquatic giants retained the basic body plan of modern dragonfly nymphs, but scaled it up to proportions that seem almost impossible. Their extensible labiums, the modified lower lips that dragonfly nymphs used to catch prey, could shoot out over a meter to snatch victims from surprising distances. Their powerful legs and streamlined bodies made them capable of rapid movement through water, while their large compound eyes gave them excellent vision for hunting in murky aquatic environments. The abundance of these aquatic giants had profound effects on the evolution of early vertebrates during the Carboniferous period. The first fish to venture into fresh water systems had to contend with arthropod predators unlike anything that exists today. This pressure drove the evolution of new defensive strategies among early vertebrates, including the heavy armor that characterized many Carboniferous fish species, and the eventual migration of some vertebrate lineages back to marine environments where giant arthropods were less common. The oxygen-rich waters that supported these giants also created unique ecological opportunities that don't exist in modern aquatic environments. The elevated dissolved oxygen levels meant that metabolically demanding predatory behaviors were much more feasible than they are today. Giant arthropods could sustain high-energy hunting activities for extended periods, allowing them to dominate their ecosystems in ways that would be impossible with modern oxygen levels. The warm temperatures of carboniferous waters also played a crucial role in supporting aquatic gigantism. Cold-blooded arthropods are much more active and efficient in warm water, and the tropical conditions that extended nearly to the poles during much of the Carboniferous period created ideal conditions for large, active predators. The combination of high oxygen and optimal temperatures created a perfect storm for aquatic arthropod evolution. Living near these waters would have been an exercise in constant vigilance for any terrestrial animals. Imagine wading through a carboniferous swamp and seeing the massive compound eyes of a 2-meter eurypterid break the surface nearby, or watching the distinctive ripples of a giant aquatic arthropod moving through the water toward shore. Even relatively shallow water would have been dangerous territory, populated by predators capable of taking down animals much larger than themselves. The success of aquatic arthropod giants also influenced the terrestrial ecosystems around them in complex ways. Many of these creatures were capable of limited movement on land, allowing them to hunt amphibians and early reptiles that ventured too close to the water's edge. This created complex ecological interactions between aquatic and terrestrial environments that have no modern parallel. The breeding behaviors of these aquatic giants must have been spectacular events. Many modern arthropods gather in large numbers for mating, and the Carboniferous aquatic giants likely did the same on an enormous scale. Imagine hundreds of meter-long eurypterids converging in shallow bays for mass mating events. Their massive claws and powerful swimming, creating underwater storms that could be seen from the surface. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these aquatic titans was their role as evolutionary bridges between different environments. Many of the largest aquatic arthropods were closely related to terrestrial species, and some appear to have been capable of surviving in both aquatic and terrestrial environments for extended periods. This flexibility allowed them to exploit resources from both ecosystems, contributing to their success as apex predators and creating complex ecological webs that connected land and water in unprecedented ways. As we'll see, the dominance of these giants, whether in the air, on land, or in the water, was intrinsically linked to the unique atmospheric conditions that made the Carboniferous period possible. But those same conditions were setting the stage for dramatic changes that would eventually bring the Age of Giants to an end. Chapter 7. The chemistry behind the giants. To truly understand how the Carboniferous world produced its incredible giants, we need to dive deep into the biological and chemical mechanisms that made such extreme sizes possible. The story isn't just about oxygen levels, and it's about how elevated oxygen fundamentally changed the rules of life itself, particularly for arthropods, and created opportunities for evolutionary experiments that have never been repeated in Earth's history. The key to understanding arthropod gigantism lies in their unique respiratory system and how it differs fundamentally from the breathing mechanisms used by vertebrates. Unlike mammals, birds, and other vertebrates, which actively pump air into their lungs and rely on blood to transport oxygen throughout their bodies, insects and other arthropods use a completely different approach called the tracheal system. This remarkable respiratory network consists of a branching system of tubes called trachea that connect directly to small openings called spiracles on the arthropod's external surface. These tubes deliver oxygen right to the tissues that need it, bypassing the need for a circulatory system to transport oxygen-carrying blood cells. It is an elegant solution that works beautifully for small arthropods, but becomes increasingly problematic as body size increases. The fundamental limitation of the tracheal system is simple physics. Oxygen moves through these tubes primarily by diffusion, and diffusion becomes progressively slower over longer distances. As arthropods grow larger, the distance that oxygen must travel from the spiracles to the deepest tissues increases dramatically, creating a bottleneck that limits how large these creatures can become. In our modern atmosphere, with its 21% oxygen content, this constraint severely limits insect size. Modern insects hit a biological wall when they try to grow beyond certain dimensions because oxygen simply can't diffuse fast enough through their respiratory systems to support large, metabolically active bodies. The largest modern insects, like the giant wettas of New Zealand or the biggest beetles, are already pushing the limits of what their respiratory systems can support with current atmospheric conditions. But in the 35% oxygen environment of the Carboniferous period, this constraint was dramatically relaxed. The steeper concentration gradient created by the elevated oxygen levels meant that diffusion could occur much more rapidly and over much greater distances. Suddenly, arthropods could support body sizes that would be physiologically impossible in our modern atmosphere. This wasn't just a minor adjustment in the possible. It was a fundamental transformation of biological limits. Research by paleobiologist John Harrison and his colleagues has demonstrated that the relationship between atmospheric oxygen and maximum arthropod size is remarkably direct and predictable. When atmospheric oxygen levels rise, the upper size limits for arthropods increase proportionally. When oxygen levels fall, those limits contract accordingly. The evidence for this relationship extends far beyond the Carboniferous period and provides compelling support for the oxygen limitation hypothesis. Throughout Earth's history, periods of elevated atmospheric oxygen have consistently coincided with the evolution of larger arthropods, while periods of low oxygen have been associated with arthropod miniaturization. The correlation is so strong that paleontologists can actually use arthropod sizes from the fossil record to estimate ancient atmospheric oxygen levels with surprising accuracy. But oxygen transport wasn't the only physiological advantage that elevated oxygen levels provided to Carboniferous arthropods. The hypercharged atmosphere also affected their metabolism in profound ways that enabled entirely new lifestyles and behaviors. With more oxygen available for cellular respiration, arthropods could sustain higher metabolic rates for longer periods, enabling more active lifestyles and more energetically expensive behaviors like extended flight, rapid growth, and complex predatory strategies. This metabolic boost was particularly important for predatory arthropods like Meganeura and the giant centipedes. Modern arthropod predators are often limited by their stamina. They can only sustain high-energy hunting behaviors for short periods before needing to rest and recover. But in the oxygen-rich Carboniferous atmosphere, these constraints were much less restrictive, allowing predators to be more active, persistent, and successful in their hunting efforts. The elevated oxygen levels also affected arthropod development in important ways that helped enable gigantism. Growing to large sizes requires sustained periods of rapid cell division and protein synthesis, both metabolically, expensive processes that are limited by oxygen availability in modern arthropods. In the Carboniferous atmosphere, young arthropods could grow faster and reach larger adult sizes than would be possible today, while also maintaining the energy reserves needed for survival and reproduction. Temperature played a crucial complementary role in enabling arthropod gigantism during the Carboniferous period. The warm, humid climate that characterized this era was ideal for arthropod physiology in multiple ways. Being ectothermic, cold-blooded, arthropods are much more active and metabolically efficient in warm conditions. The tropical climate that extended nearly to the poles during much of the Carboniferous period meant that giant arthropods could remain active year-round rather than being forced into seasonal dormancy that would waste precious energy reserves. The combination of elevated oxygen and optimal temperatures created a perfect storm for arthropod evolution, But there was another crucial factor that made Carboniferous gigantism possible: the absence of competition from large vertebrates. In our modern world, many ecological niches that might otherwise be occupied by large arthropods are instead filled by vertebrates like birds, mammals, and reptiles that are generally more efficient at large body sizes. During the Carboniferous period, however, vertebrates were still relatively small and limited in their ecological roles. Birds didn't exist, mammals were hundreds of millions of years in the future, and most reptiles were still small, primitive creatures struggling to adapt to terrestrial life. This left enormous ecological opportunities for arthropods to fill opportunities they exploited by growing to unprecedented sizes and diversifying into roles that would later be taken over by vertebrates. The feeding ecology of the Carboniferous world also provided crucial support for arthropod gigantism. The massive forests of scale trees and other primitive plants produced enormous amounts of organic matter, supporting complex food webs with multiple trophic levels that could sustain large predators. Dead plant material accumulated in thick layers on the forest floor, supporting vast populations of decomposer arthropods, which in turn fed larger predatory species. This abundance of food meant that the metabolic costs of supporting large body sizes could be offset by the increased feeding efficiency that came with being bigger. Large predators could tackle prey that smaller arthropods couldn't handle, while large herbivores could process tough plant materials more efficiently than their smaller relatives, taking advantage of gut volume scaling relationships that favor larger body sizes. The biomechanical challenges of gigantism were also less severe in the Carboniferous environment. The higher atmospheric density that resulted from elevated oxygen levels provided more aerodynamic support for flying insects, making it easier for creatures like Meganeura to achieve powered flight despite their large size. The warm, humid atmosphere also reduced the risk of desiccation that can limit arthropod size in dry environments. Understanding the chemistry behind Carboniferous gigantism also helps explain why it came to an end so definitively. As we'll see in later chapters, changes in atmospheric oxygen levels, climate, and the evolution of new competitors would eventually conspire to bring the age of giant arthropods to a close. But for 60 million years, the unique chemical and physical conditions of the Carboniferous world allow the arthropods to explore evolutionary possibilities that have never been available before or since, creating a chapter in Earth's history that stands alone in its biological extravagance. Chapter 8: The Great Oxygen Factory. Transformation of Earth's atmosphere from normal to supercharged didn't happen overnight. The rise to 35% oxygen was the result of a complex interplay of biological innovations, geological processes, and sheer evolutionary accident that created the most dramatic atmospheric shift in our planet's history since the Great Oxidation Event over 2 billion years earlier. Understanding how this oxygen factory operated requires us to examine the unique combination of factors that made the Carboniferous period so extraordinary. At the heart of this transformation was the evolution of lignin and the forests it made possible, but the story goes much deeper than just woody plants. The Carboniferous oxygen surge was the result of a perfect storm of biological, geological, and climatic factors that came together in a way that has never been repeated in Earth's history. The story begins with the position of the continents themselves during the Carboniferous period. The major landmasses were drifting toward each other in the slow-motion collision that would eventually create the supercontinent Pangaea. This continental arrangement created vast areas of low-lying land perfectly suited for forest growth, while the collision process itself generated extensive mountain ranges that influenced global weather patterns in ways that favored massive forest development. The climate during this period was unlike anything in Earth's modern history. Warm, humid conditions extended from the equator nearly to the poles, creating a global greenhouse that supported luxuriant forest growth across enormous areas. There were no ice caps at the poles, no frozen tundra, and no desert regions comparable to those that exist today. Instead, the entire planet was essentially one vast tropical zone perfect for plant growth. These conditions created the perfect environment for the evolution and spread of the first extensive forests. The scale trees, giant ferns, and early seed plants that dominated Carboniferous landscapes weren't just individual trees scattered across the continents. They formed continuous forest systems that stretched across millions of square kilometers without interruption. What made these forests truly extraordinary as oxygen producers was their unique growth pattern and life cycle. Unlike modern forests, which exist in a relatively stable equilibrium with their environment, Carboniferous forests were part of a one-way process that continuously removed carbon from the atmosphere without returning it through the normal decomposition cycle. The key was lignin's remarkable resistance to decomposition. When a modern tree dies, it's quickly attacked by a sophisticated ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and other decomposers that break down its tissues and return the carbon to the atmosphere as CO2. This process typically takes just a few years to a few decades, maintaining a rough balance between carbon removal through photosynthesis and carbon release through decomposition. But in the Carboniferous world, this balance was completely disrupted. The bacteria and fungi of the time had evolved sophisticated mechanisms for breaking down cellulose and other simple plant compounds, but they were completely unable to digest lignin. The enzymatic pathways needed to break down lignin's complex aromatic structure simply didn't exist in any organism on Earth. The result was accumulation on an almost unimaginable scale. Dead trees didn't rot. They simply piled up where they fell, year after year for millions of years. In many areas, layers of preserved plant matter accumulated to depths of dozens of meters, creating vast repositories of carbon that had been permanently removed from the atmospheric system. These weren't isolated deposits scattered randomly across the landscape. They formed continuous layers across entire continents. The coal deposits that we mine today in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, England, and other regions represent just a fraction of the organic matter that was buried during the Carboniferous period. Much of it has been destroyed by subsequent geological processes, but what remains gives us a glimpse of the incredible scale of carbon burial that occurred during this unique period. The scale of carbon burial during the Carboniferous period was staggering beyond comprehension. Geologists estimate that the rate of organic carbon burial was hundreds of times higher than normal background rates throughout Earth's history. This massive burial of carbon had two immediate and profound effects on Earth's atmosphere. Atmospheric CO2 levels plummeted while oxygen levels soared. The process was accelerated by the unique geography and geology of the Carboniferous world. Many of the major forest systems grew in low-lying areas that were regularly flooded by shallow seas or extensive river systems. When trees fell, they were often rapidly buried by sediments carried by these waterways, preventing even the limited decomposition that might have been possible if they had remained exposed to air and the few organisms capable of breaking down woody tissue. The warm, humid climate also played a crucial role in maximizing oxygen production throughout the period. The tropical conditions that dominated most of the planet meant that photosynthesis could occur year-round across vast areas. There were no seasonal shutdowns, no winter dormancy periods that would halt oxygen production, just continuous, relentless removal of CO2 from the atmosphere and release of oxygen by billions of plants working around the clock. The diversity of Carboniferous plant life also contributed significantly to the oxygen surge. Different plant species had different ecological roles and growth patterns, But they all shared the crucial trait of producing large amounts of lignin-rich tissue that couldn't be decomposed by contemporary organisms. Tree ferns grew rapidly and fell frequently, creating massive accumulations of organic matter in forest clearings and along waterways. Scale trees grew to enormous sizes before toppling, contributing huge amounts of biomass to the burial process. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Carboniferous oxygen factory was its global scale and coordination. This wasn't a localized phenomenon confined to a few favorable regions. It was happening simultaneously across most of the planet's land surface. From what is now North America to Europe to Asia, vast forests were growing, dying, and accumulating, all contributing to the same atmospheric transformation. The speed of this transformation was equally remarkable when viewed in geological context. While most atmospheric changes occur over timescales of tens of millions of years, the rise to peak oxygen levels happened relatively quickly. Starting from normal levels around 350 million years ago, atmospheric oxygen reached its peak of 35%. By about 300 million years ago, a transformation accomplished in just 50 million years, which is remarkably fast for such a fundamental change in planetary chemistry. This rapid change had profound effects on global climate systems that fed back into the oxygen production process itself. As CO2 levels dropped and oxygen levels rose, the planet began to cool gradually. The greenhouse effect that had maintained warm, humid conditions across the globe began to weaken, setting the stage for dramatic climate changes that would eventually help bring the Age of Giants to an end. The Carboniferous oxygen factory was ultimately a victim of its own success. By removing so much CO2 from the atmosphere, it triggered cooling that would eventually limit forest growth in many regions. And by creating perfect conditions for arthropod gigantism, it set up evolutionary pressures that would drive the development of new competitors and predators that would eventually challenge arthropod dominance. But for 60 million years, this biological oxygen factory transformed Earth into a world unlike any other in our planet's history. A world where the very air was fuel for giants, where fire was a dominant ecological force, and where arthropods could grow to sizes that seem impossible today. The legacy of this extraordinary period continues to shape our world, providing the fossil fuels that powered the Industrial Revolution and reminding us of just how dramatically biological innovations can reshape an entire planet. Chapter 9. The world that fire built. Living in the Carboniferous world meant living with fire as a constant, terrifying presence that shaped every aspect of existence. The 35% oxygen atmosphere transformed fire from an occasional natural phenomenon into a geological force that shaped entire ecosystems, drove evolutionary innovation, and created landscapes unlike anything that has existed before or since. To understand the Carboniferous world, you must understand that it was fundamentally a world built and maintained by fire. To grasp the role of fire in the Carboniferous world, you need to abandon every assumption you have about how fires behave. In our modern environment, in our 21% oxygen atmosphere, fires require specific conditions to start and spread: dry fuel, ignition sources, favorable wind conditions, and sustained heat. Firefighters can usually control blazes with water and fire retardant chemicals because fires follow predictable patterns and have clear limitations. But in the hypercharged atmosphere of the Carboniferous period, fire became an almost living entity with its own agenda and capabilities that defied normal expectations. Scientists have calculated that with 35% atmospheric oxygen, even waterlogged wood would ignite and burn readily. The elevated oxygen levels meant that virtually any organic material could serve as fuel, and once fires started, they burned with an intensity and persistence that has no Modern equivalent that the physics of combustion in a high-oxygen environment are fundamentally different from what we experience today. Fire spreads faster, burns hotter, and consumes materials that would be fire-resistant under normal conditions. In the Carboniferous atmosphere, forest fires wouldn't just spread from tree to tree through normal heat transfer and flame propagation. They would explode across the landscape, creating their own weather systems and generating tornado-like fire whirls that could carry burning debris for hundreds of kilometers. The evidence for these mega fires is written throughout the geological record of the Carboniferous period in ways that leave no doubt about their scale and frequency. Charcoal deposits from this era aren't scattered remnants of occasional fires. They represent continent-spanning conflagrations that regularly swept across the planet with a regularity that would be unimaginable today. Some charcoal layers extend across thousands of square kilometers, indicating single fire events that burned areas larger than entire modern countries. These deposits often contain charcoal from multiple plant species, showing that fires consumed entire forest ecosystems rather than just affecting particular vegetation types. The thickness of some charcoal layers suggests that fires burned so intensely that they completely carbonized massive amounts of organic matter. These weren't just bigger versions of modern forest fires. They were fundamentally different phenomena that followed completely different rules. In the oxygen-rich Carboniferous atmosphere, fires could burn underground through layers of accumulated organic matter, smoldering for months or even years before erupting to the surface in massive firestorms that could be seen from hundreds of kilometers away. They could cross rivers and wetlands that would stop modern fires completely, sustained by the supercharged atmosphere that provided enough oxygen to maintain combustion, even in normally fire-resistant environments. The fires burned so hot that they could consume green, living vegetation with high water content that would normally be completely fire-resistant. The frequency of these mega-fires was equally staggering and unprecedented in Earth's history. Rather than occurring every few decades or centuries like modern forest fires, Carboniferous firestorms may have swept across many regions every few years. The combination of abundant fuel from accumulated dead vegetation and the fire-prone atmosphere created conditions where fires were not just common, but essentially inevitable. Lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous combustion from heat buildup in organic matter, or even the friction from falling trees could trigger blazes that would consume millions of acres. The atmosphere itself had become so reactive that fire was always just a spark away from transforming vast landscapes. Living in this environment required evolutionary adaptations unlike anything we see in modern ecosystems. Plants didn't just have to survive occasional fires. They had to thrive in a world where fire was a regular, predictable part of the environment. Many species evolved thick, fire-resistant bark that could protect their vital cambium layers from all but the most intense fires. Some plants developed the ability to regenerate rapidly from underground root systems after fires passed through, essentially treating regular burning as a normal part of their life cycle. These species could resprout from their roots within days or weeks of a fire, quickly colonizing the nutrient-rich ash beds left behind by burned forests. Even more remarkably, some Carboniferous plants actually became dependent on fire for reproduction. These species evolved seeds that required the intense heat of fires to germinate properly, ensuring that new generations would emerge from the ashes of burned forests. This fire-dependent reproduction strategy allowed these plants to quickly colonize areas cleared by fires, giving them a competitive advantage in the fire-dominated landscapes of the time. The animals of the Carboniferous world also had to develop extraordinary adaptations to deal with the constant threat of fire. Many species evolved sophisticated behaviors that allowed them to detect and escape approaching fires. The ability to sense smoke, changes in air pressure, or the electromagnetic fields generated by large fires became crucial survival skills. Some arthropods developed the ability to survive underground during fire events, burrowing deep into soil or hiding in cave systems until the danger passed. Others evolved rapid reproduction strategies that allowed populations to recover quickly after fires swept through their habitats, ensuring species survival even when individual mortality was high. The giant arthropods that dominated Carboniferous ecosystems had their own strategies for dealing with fire that took advantage of their size and mobility. Some species appear to have been capable of detecting fires from great distances, possibly through chemical cues in the atmosphere or by sensing the electromagnetic disturbances that large fires create, allowing them to migrate away from danger zones before fires arrived. Others may have used their large size and mobility to outrun fires, crossing rivers or other barriers that smaller animals couldn't navigate. The aquatic giants of the Carboniferous period had a natural refuge from fire in the extensive wetland systems of the time. Though even they weren't completely safe, the most intense fires could boil shallow water and create smoke conditions that made aquatic environments uninhabitable for extended periods. Perhaps most remarkably, fire played a crucial role in regulating the very atmospheric conditions that made the Carboniferous world possible. While the accumulation of lignin-rich plant matter was pumping oxygen into the atmosphere at unprecedented rates, the regular megafires provided a natural release valve that prevented oxygen levels from climbing even higher to potentially catastrophic levels. When plants burned, their carbon combined with atmospheric oxygen to form carbon dioxide, temporarily reducing oxygen levels and returning some carbon to the atmosphere. Without this natural burning process, atmospheric oxygen could theoretically have continued climbing indefinitely, potentially reaching levels where spontaneous combustion would make complex life impossible. The fires also played a crucial role in nutrient cycling that had no equivalent in modern ecosystems. The intense heat of Carboniferous fires could break down organic compounds that normal decomposition couldn't handle, releasing nutrients back into ecosystems where they could support new plant growth. In many ways, fire served as the primary decomposer in Carboniferous ecosystems, performing the role that bacteria and fungi play in modern environments. The psychological impact of living with constant fire would have been profound for any creatures capable of understanding the threat. The distant smell of smoke could signal an approaching wall of flames moving faster than anything could run. The stress of constant vigilance would have been a powerful evolutionary pressure, driving innovations in sensory systems, escape behaviors, and survival strategies that we can only imagine. Yet despite the constant threat, or perhaps because of it, the Carboniferous world supported more diverse and spectacular life than had ever existed on land. The fire-dominated landscapes created a complex mosaic of habitats, recently burned areas rich in nutrients, recovering forests with young vegetation, and mature stands waiting for the next fire cycle that supported incredible biological diversity and drove rapid evolutionary innovation. Fire was both destroyer and creator in the Carboniferous world, shaping ecosystems and driving evolution in ways that would be impossible in our modern atmosphere. But as we'll see, the same forces that made this fire-dominated world possible were also setting the stage for dramatic changes that would eventually bring the Age of Giants to an end. Chapter 10. The Cooling World. The Carboniferous world's extraordinary atmospheric conditions couldn't last forever. The same processes that had created the oxygen-rich environment were simultaneously setting in motion changes that would eventually transform the planet once again. By the Late Carboniferous period, a complex interplay of climate change, evolving organisms, and shifting geological conditions was beginning to threaten the giants' dominance in ways that would fundamentally reshape life on Earth. The first signs of change came from the atmosphere itself, where the massive burial of carbon in Carboniferous forests had been removing CO2 from the atmosphere for millions of years. This process was beginning to have dramatic effects on global climate that would cascade through every ecosystem on the planet. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and as its levels dropped from the extreme highs of the early Carboniferous to much lower concentrations, the planet began to cool significantly. The cooling was gradual at first, occurring over millions of years, but its effects were profound and far-reaching. The warm, humid conditions that had supported vast forests across most of the planet began to retreat toward the equator. For the first time in tens of millions of years, ice caps began forming at the poles, locking up enormous amounts of water and causing sea levels to drop dramatically. This climate change had cascading effects throughout Carboniferous ecosystems that touched every aspect of life on the planet. The extensive wetland systems that had supported aquatic giants began to dry up as the planet cooled and precipitation patterns shifted. Many of the low-lying areas where forests had thrived became too dry to support the massive-scale trees and other water-loving plants that had dominated Carboniferous landscapes. As forests shrank and fragmented, the rate of carbon burial began to slow for the first time in millions of years, gradually reducing the atmospheric input of oxygen that had driven the entire Carboniferous experiment. At the same time, the cooling climate was making it increasingly difficult for large, cold-blooded arthropods to remain active year-round. The warm temperatures that had enabled giant arthropods to function efficiently throughout the year were disappearing, forcing them to become less active during cooler periods or seek out increasingly limited warm refugia. This reduction in activity time made it much harder for large arthropods to gather the resources they needed to maintain their massive bodies and reproduce successfully. But climate change wasn't the only threat facing the giants of the Carboniferous world. Evolution was producing new players that would fundamentally alter the rules of the game in ways that no one could have predicted. The most significant of these developments was the evolution of more efficient lignin-degrading organisms that would break the cycle of carbon burial that had made the oxygen-rich atmosphere possible. For tens of millions of years, dead plant matter had accumulated because nothing in the natural world could digest lignin effectively. The molecular structure of lignin had proven to be an impregnable fortress that resisted all attempts at biological breakdown. But evolution never stops experimenting, and gradually, some fungi began developing the enzymatic machinery needed to break down this supposedly indestructible compound. The first lignin-degrading fungi appeared near the end of the Carboniferous period, around 290 million years ago. These white rot fungi, as they came to be known, possessed revolutionary enzymes called lignin peroxidases that could systematically dismantle lignin's complex molecular structure. For the first time since lignin had evolved, dead plant matter could be completely decomposed, returning its carbon to the atmosphere as CO2. The evolution of lignin-degrading fungi had immediate and dramatic effects on global carbon cycling. Newly fallen trees that would previously have remained preserved indefinitely were now consumed by decomposition within years or decades. The massive accumulation of organic matter that had been the hallmark of Carboniferous forests began to slow and eventually reverse in many regions. As decomposition rates increased, the one-way removal of carbon from the atmosphere came to an end. CO2 levels began to stabilize and eventually rise again, while oxygen production slowed dramatically. The atmospheric transformation that had defined the Carboniferous period was essentially over, marking the end of one of the most extraordinary chapters in Earth's atmospheric history. But perhaps even more significant than these, environmental changes was the evolution of new competitors for the ecological niches that giant Arthropods had dominated for millions of years. The Late Carboniferous and early Permian periods saw rapid diversification among vertebrates, particularly reptiles that were becoming increasingly well-adapted to terrestrial life. These early reptiles were developing characteristics that would eventually make them formidable competitors for arthropods in ways that had never been possible before. They were becoming larger, more active, and more sophisticated in their hunting strategies. Some evolved the ability to fly, challenging the aerial dominance that had belonged exclusively to insects for tens of millions of years. The evolution of more sophisticated vertebrate predators created entirely new selective pressures for arthropods that had never existed during the height of the Carboniferous period. Being large was no longer automatically advantageous if it made you a more conspicuous target for vertebrate predators with capabilities that arthropods couldn't match. The evolutionary arms race that had driven arthropods toward gigantism began to reverse as smaller, faster, more agile forms gained advantages in a world increasingly dominated by vertebrate predators. The massive size that had been such an advantage in a world of arthropod competitors became a liability. When faced with vertebrates that combined large size with sophisticated nervous systems and efficient metabolisms at the same time, vertebrates were beginning to exploit many of the ecological niches that had previously been available only to arthropods. Large herbivorous reptiles began competing with giant millipedes for plant resources, while predatory reptiles challenged the dominance of giant centipedes and other arthropod predators in terrestrial ecosystems. The changing atmospheric composition also began to favor vertebrates over arthropods in fundamental ways. As oxygen levels dropped from their Carboniferous peaks, the respiratory advantages that had allowed arthropods to grow to enormous sizes were gradually reduced. Vertebrates, with their more efficient oxygen transport systems based on active circulation and hemoglobin, were less affected by declining oxygen levels. The geological processes that had shaped the Carboniferous world were also undergoing dramatic changes during this transitional period. The slow-motion collision of continents that would eventually form the supercontinent Pangaea was accelerating, creating massive mountain ranges and altering global weather patterns in ways that fundamentally changed the distribution of habitats suitable for giant arthropods. The formation of the Appalachian Mountains in North America and the Hercynian Mountains in Europe created rain shadows that turned previously lush, humid regions into much drier environments unsuitable for the water-loving plants that had dominated Carboniferous ecosystems. These massive mountain-building events also triggered increased volcanic activity that pumped additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, contributing to climate instability. The changing geography had profound effects on ocean circulation patterns, which in turn influenced global climate in complex ways. The formation of Pangaea gradually eliminated many of the shallow, tropical seas that had characterized the Carboniferous world, replacing them with vast continental interiors that experienced much more extreme temperature variations between seasons. These continental interiors were particularly hostile to giant arthropods, which had evolved in the stable, warm, humid conditions of the Carboniferous period. The temperature extremes and low humidity of these new environments made it impossible for large, cold-blooded arthropods to survive, forcing them to retreat to increasingly limited coastal refugia. The plant communities that had supported Carboniferous ecosystems were also undergoing revolutionary changes during this period. The evolution of more sophisticated sea plants, particularly early conifers and their relatives, began to replace the primitive scale trees and tree ferns that had dominated earlier forests. These new plants were better adapted to drier, more variable climates, but produced different types of organic matter that supported different kinds of animal communities. The new plant communities were also more resistant to the massive fires that had been such a characteristic feature of the Carboniferous world. while the oxygen-rich atmosphere still made fires frequent and intense. The changing vegetation reduced the availability of the fine, flammable organic matter that had fueled the continent-spanning conflagrations of the earlier period. This reduction in fire frequency and intensity had complex effects on arthropod communities. While it reduced one major source of mortality and habitat destruction, it also eliminated the nutrient cycling and habitat creation that fires had provided. Many arthropod species had evolved to depend on the regular disturbance cycles created by fires, and their reduction contributed to the ongoing reorganization of terrestrial ecosystems. The marine environments that had supported aquatic arthropod giants were also undergoing dramatic changes during this transitional period. The cooling climate and changing sea levels caused many of the shallow tropical seas that had been perfect habitat for giant eurypterids and other aquatic arthropods to disappear entirely. The formation of Pangaea gradually eliminated the shallow seaways that had connected different ocean basins, creating more isolated marine environments with different circulation patterns and climate conditions. These changes disrupted the oceanic food webs that had supported large marine arthropods, contributing to their decline and eventual extinction. At the same time, marine vertebrates were undergoing their own evolutionary radiation, producing new types of fish, early marine reptiles, and other predators that competed directly with arthropods for marine resources. The oceans were becoming increasingly dominated by vertebrate predators, leaving fewer opportunities for large arthropods to thrive. The combination of climate change, evolving decomposers, increasing vertebrate competition, and changing geology created a perfect storm that would eventually end the age of arthropod giants. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It played out over millions of years as ecosystems gradually adjusted to changing conditions. The Late Carboniferous period saw the first clear signs of arthropod decline. Some of the largest species began to disappear from the fossil record, while new, smaller forms began to appear and diversify. The diversity of giant arthropods remained high for several million years, but their maximum sizes began to shrink as environmental conditions became less favorable. The behavioral ecology of arthropods also began to change during this period, as they adapted to increasing pressure from vertebrate competitors. Many species evolved more cryptic lifestyles, becoming more nocturnal or developing better camouflage to avoid detection by vertebrate predators. Others evolved faster reproductive cycles, investing less energy in individual growth and more in rapid reproduction. Some arthropod lineages attempted to compete directly with vertebrates by evolving more sophisticated behaviors and sensory capabilities. A few species developed rudimentary social behaviors, primitive communication systems, and improved learning abilities. However, these innovations were generally too late to prevent the overall decline of giant arthropods. The evolutionary transition wasn't just about size. It represented a fundamental shift in how terrestrial ecosystems were organized and controlled. The arthropod-dominated world of the Carboniferous was giving way to ecosystems increasingly controlled by vertebrates, setting the stage for the age of reptiles that would follow and eventually lead to the rise of dinosaurs. The changing food webs during this transitional period were incredibly complex, with old ecological relationships breaking down and new ones forming. Predator-prey dynamics that had been stable for millions of years were disrupted as new players entered the game and environmental conditions shifted. Competition for resources became increasingly intense as habitats shrank and changed. Many arthropod species that had coexisted peacefully during the resource-abundant Carboniferous period found themselves competing directly for increasingly limited food sources and suitable breeding sites. The reproductive strategies of many arthropod species also evolved during this period in response to changing conditions. Species that had previously invested heavily in producing a few large offspring began shifting towards strategies that produced many smaller offspring with shorter generation times. This allowed populations to adapt more quickly to changing conditions, but often came at the cost of individual competitiveness. The giants had ruled the Earth for 60 million years, longer than mammals have dominated terrestrial ecosystems. But their time was coming to an end, and the world was about to enter a new phase of its evolutionary history. The stage was set for the final act in the drama of Carboniferous gigantism and ending that would be both gradual and catastrophic, playing out over millions of years before culminating in one of the most severe mass extinctions in Earth's history. The legacy of this extraordinary period would live on in the coal deposits they helped create, in the fossil record that preserves their memory, and in the atmospheric conditions that would continue to influence Earth's climate for millions of years to come. But the age of giants was ending, and a new chapter in Earth's biological history was about to begin. Chapter 11. The End of the Giants. The reign of the giants was coming to an end, but their disappearance wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a gradual decline that played out over millions of years as the extraordinary conditions that had made them possible slowly faded away. By the end of the Permian period, about 250 million years ago, the world of 35% oxygen and monster arthropods had become just a memory preserved in stone, marking the end of one of the most extraordinary chapters in Earth's biological history. The final blow to the arthropod giants came from an unexpected source that had been millions of years in the making: the evolution of flying vertebrates. For over 100 million years, insects had ruled the skies without any significant competition, free to grow as large as the oxygen-rich atmosphere would allow. But during the late Permian and early Triassic periods, the first flying reptiles began to appear, and they brought with them capabilities that no arthropod could match. These early flying reptiles, the ancestors of pterosaurs, were larger, faster, and more maneuverable than even the biggest Carboniferous insects. More importantly, they were active predators specifically adapted to hunt flying prey, with sophisticated sensory systems, powerful flight muscles, and predatory instincts honed by millions of years of vertebrate evolution. The emergence of these aerial vertebrates represented a fundamental shift in the evolutionary arms race that had been escalating throughout the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods. Unlike the gradual environmental changes that have been slowly eroding the advantages of gigantism, the appearance of flying reptiles created immediate and direct competition for the ecological niches that giant flying insects had monopolized. For tens of millions of years, for giant dragonflies like Meganeura, which had dominated Carboniferous skies as apex predators for tens of millions of years, the evolution of flying reptiles spelled doom. The evolutionary advantages that had made gigantism beneficial for aerial arthropods, better maneuverability, improved predatory capability, reduced vulnerability to ground-based threats, suddenly became liabilities when faced with vertebrate predators that were even larger, faster, and more sophisticated. The physiological advantages that vertebrates brought to aerial competition were overwhelming. Their internal skeletons provided structural support that was both stronger and lighter than the external skeletons of arthropods, allowing for more efficient flight mechanics and better power-to-weight ratios. Their advanced respiratory systems, based on active lung ventilation rather than passive diffusion, remained highly efficient even as atmospheric oxygen levels declined from their Carboniferous peaks. Perhaps most importantly, the sophisticated nervous systems of vertebrates enabled complex flight behaviors that arthropods simply couldn't match. While giant dragonflies were limited to relatively simple flight patterns based on instinctive responses, early flying reptiles could learn from experience, adapt their hunting strategies in real time, and coordinate complex aerial maneuvers. that gave them decisive advantages in both hunting and avoiding predation. The impact was swift and decisive in geological terms. Large flying insects began disappearing from the fossil record as flying reptiles diversified and spread across the globe. The aerial niches that had been filled by giant arthropods for millions of years were rapidly taken over by vertebrates that could exploit them more efficiently. This aerial revolution had cascading effects throughout terrestrial ecosystems. The disappearance of giant flying predators like Meganeura disrupted food webs that had been stable for millions of years, creating opportunities for some species while eliminating others. Many smaller flying insects actually benefited from the disappearance of their giant predators, leading to evolutionary radiations in groups that had previously been suppressed by predation pressure. On the ground, the story was similar but played out over a longer time frame. The continued evolution of large reptiles created increasing pressure on terrestrial arthropod giants. Creatures like Arthropleura, which had thrived in a world where the largest land predators were other arthropods, found themselves facing vertebrate predators with capabilities they couldn't match or defend against. The terrestrial vertebrates of the late Permian period represented a quantum leap in predatory sophistication compared to the early amphibians and reptiles of the Carboniferous. These new predators possessed advanced sensory systems, including improved eyesight, hearing, and chemical detection capabilities that made them incredibly efficient hunters. Their muscular systems were more powerful and efficient, allowing for sustained pursuit of prey across long distances. Reptiles brought several crucial advantages to the evolutionary arms race that arthropods simply couldn't compete with. Their internal skeletons allowed them to achieve large sizes, without the weight penalties that limited arthropods with their external skeletons. Their more efficient respiratory and circulatory systems made them less dependent on the elevated oxygen levels that arthropods required for gigantism. Most importantly, their more sophisticated nervous systems enabled complex behaviors, learning capabilities, and social interactions that gave them decisive advantages in competition and predation. While arthropods were limited by their relatively simple nervous systems, vertebrates could adapt their behavior in real time, learn from experience, and develop complex strategies that arthropods couldn't counter. The behavioral sophistication of late Permian reptiles extended to their hunting strategies, which became increasingly complex and coordinated. Some species developed pack hunting behaviors, allowing them to take down prey much larger than any individual could handle alone. Others evolved ambush tactics that exploited the sensory limitations of arthropods, striking from concealment with lightning speed. The climate changes that had begun in the late Carboniferous continued to accelerate during the Permian period, creating conditions that increasingly favored vertebrates over arthropods. As temperatures dropped and atmospheric oxygen levels declined, the environmental conditions that had favored arthropod gigantism gradually disappeared. The warm, humid climate that had been ideal for large, cold-blooded arthropods was being replaced by a cooler, more variable climate where smaller, more efficient organisms had significant advantages. The extensive wetland systems that had supported aquatic arthropod giants were drying up as the climate changed and ice caps grew at the poles. This climatic transformation was particularly devastating for arthropods because of their physiological limitations. Being ectothermic, arthropods depend heavily on environmental temperature to maintain their metabolic rates. As global temperatures declined and became more variable, large arthropods found it increasingly difficult to maintain the high metabolic rates necessary to support their massive bodies. The seasonal temperature variations that began to characterize many regions during the Permian period were especially problematic for giant arthropods. Unlike smaller species that could seek shelter during cold periods or enter dormancy, Large arthropods required enormous amounts of energy to maintain their basic physiological functions and couldn't afford extended periods of inactivity. The evolution of lignin-degrading fungi also continued to transform terrestrial ecosystems throughout the Permian period. As these organisms became more widespread and efficient, the massive accumulation of organic matter that had characterized Carboniferous forests came to an end. Dead plant material was now decomposed quickly and efficiently, preventing the carbon burial that had driven atmospheric oxygen to extraordinary levels. The spread of white rot fungi and other lignin-degrading organisms was facilitated by the changing climate and plant communities of the Permian period. The new plant species that were replacing Carboniferous flora often had different chemical compositions that were more susceptible to fungal attack, accelerating the breakdown of organic matter. This transformation of decomposition processes had profound effects on soil chemistry and nutrient cycling throughout terrestrial ecosystems. The rapid breakdown of organic matter that had previously accumulated for millions of years released enormous quantities of nutrients into soils, creating conditions that favored fast-growing plant species over the slow-growing giants that had characterized Carboniferous forests. By the Middle Permian period, atmospheric oxygen levels had dropped to around 23%, still higher than modern levels, but far below the 35% peaks of the Late Carboniferous. This decline made it increasingly difficult for large arthropods to maintain the metabolic rates necessary to support their massive bodies and compete effectively with more efficient vertebrates. The declining oxygen levels affected different arthropod groups in different ways. Flying insects were particularly vulnerable because flight is one of the most metabolically demanding activities in the animal kingdom. As oxygen levels dropped, the largest flying insects were the first to suffer, gradually being outcompeted by smaller, more efficient species. Terrestrial arthropods were somewhat less affected initially, but they too began to feel the constraints of declining oxygen levels as competition intensified. The reduced respiratory efficiency made it harder for large arthropods to sustain the high activity levels necessary for successful predation or escape from predators. Many arthropod lineages began evolving towards smaller sizes as the advantages of gigantism disappeared and the costs became prohibitive. Others simply went extinct, unable to adapt quickly enough to the changing conditions. The diversity of giant arthropods that had characterized the Carboniferous world began to collapse as ecosystems reorganized around vertebrate dominance. The process of size reduction in arthropod lineages during the Permian period was complex and varied among different groups. Some species underwent gradual size reduction over millions of years, with each generation being slightly smaller than the previous one. Others showed more dramatic shifts, with distinct evolutionary breaks between large ancestral forms and smaller descendant species. Interestingly, some arthropod groups attempted to maintain their large size by evolving more efficient respiratory systems or modified body plans that reduced the metabolic costs of gigantism. A few lineages developed more sophisticated behavioral strategies that allowed them to compete with vertebrates despite their physiological limitations. The end of the Permian period brought the final chapter in the story of arthropod gigantism, with a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The massive volcanic eruptions of the Siberian traps released enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, triggering rapid global warming and the most severe mass extinction in Earth's history. The Siberian traps eruptions were unlike any volcanic event in recorded geological history. They covered an area of over 2 million square kilometers with lava flows and pumped unprecedented quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The scale of these eruptions was so vast that they fundamentally altered global climate and ocean chemistry. This great dying, as it's known to paleontologists, wiped out over 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species. The already declining populations of giant arthropods were largely eliminated, ending over 60 million years of dominance and closing the book on one of the most extraordinary periods in Earth's biological history. The extinction mechanisms during the Great Dying were complex and multifaceted. Rapid global warming created temperature conditions that many species couldn't tolerate. Ocean acidification and anoxia eliminated vast areas of marine habitat. On land, the combination of extreme temperatures, acid rain, and atmospheric toxicity created conditions that few large organisms could survive. For the remaining giant arthropods, the Great Dying represented the final blow to groups that were already struggling with declining atmospheric oxygen, changing climate, and increased competition from vertebrates. The few species that had managed to survive the earlier challenges were simply overwhelmed by the scale and speed of the environmental changes triggered by the Siberian traps, eruptions. But the legacy of the supercharged Carboniferous world extends far beyond the fossil record and continues to shape our modern world in profound ways. The massive coal deposits formed during this period became the foundation of the Industrial Revolution and continue to provide energy for human civilization today. Every piece of coal we burn represents carbon that was pulled from the atmosphere by Carboniferous forest carbon that had been locked away for over 300 million years until we began releasing it back into the atmosphere. The energy that powered the Industrial Revolution and much of our modern technology is essentially stored Carboniferous sunlight, captured by ancient forests and preserved by the unique conditions that prevented decomposition. The scale of carbon storage that occurred during the Carboniferous period is almost incomprehensible. Geologists estimate that the coal deposits formed during this period contain more carbon than exists in all current living biomass on Earth. This vast reservoir of ancient carbon has become a double-edged legacy, providing the energy that enabled human technological civilization while also contributing to modern climate change. The Carboniferous period also provides crucial insights into how atmospheric changes can reshape life on Earth in ways that are relevant to our current situation. The dramatic transformation from normal to hypercharged oxygen levels demonstrates just how profoundly atmospheric composition can influence evolution, ecosystem structure, and the possible forms that life can take. Modern climate change represents, in some ways, the reverse of what happened during the Carboniferous period. Instead of removing carbon from the atmosphere and increasing oxygen levels, we're rapidly adding carbon and creating atmospheric conditions that haven't existed for millions of years. The Carboniferous teaches us that such changes can have profound and long-lasting effects on life itself. The parallels between the Carboniferous atmospheric transformation and modern climate change are both instructive and sobering. Both involve rapid changes to atmospheric composition driven by biological processes, plant evolution in the Carboniferous, human industrial activity today. Both demonstrate how biological innovations can have planet-wide consequences that persist for millions of years. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous also remind us that the creatures sharing our planet today represent just a tiny fraction of the forms that life has taken throughout Earth's history. For tens of millions of years, our planet was dominated by creatures so alien to our experience that they seem like science fiction. Dragonflies the size of eagles, millipedes longer than cars, and centipedes that could look a human in the eye were not fantasy. They were the reality of life on Earth for longer than mammals have existed. Their existence challenges our assumptions about what's possible in biology and reminds us that evolution is capable of producing forms that exceed our wildest imagination. The diversity of giant arthropods during the Carboniferous period was staggering, encompassing forms and ecological roles that have no modern equivalents. These creatures filled niches in ways that modern ecosystems simply cannot replicate, creating food webs and ecological interactions of unprecedented complexity and scale. Perhaps most remarkably, the Carboniferous period demonstrates the incredible creativity of evolution when environmental constraints are removed. Given the right conditions, elevated oxygen, warm climate, abundant resources, and freedom from large vertebrate competitors, arthropods explored size ranges and ecological roles that seem impossible today. The oxygen-rich atmosphere of the maze Carboniferous enabled evolutionary experiments that have never been repeated and likely never will be again. It was a unique moment in Earth's history when the rules of biology were temporarily rewritten, allowing life to explore possibilities that remain close to us today. The biomechanical innovations that evolved during this period were remarkable in their sophistication and effectiveness. Giant arthropods developed structural solutions to the challenges of supporting massive bodies that rivaled the engineering achievements of modern technology. Their respiratory systems, muscular arrangements, and sensory capabilities represented the pinnacle of arthropod design. The giants are gone, but their legacy lives on in multiple ways. The coal deposits that power our modern world, the fossil record that preserves their memory, and the lessons they teach us about the relationship between atmosphere and life all continue to influence our understanding of our planet and our place on it. Today, as we grapple with our own atmospheric changes, the Carboniferous period serves as both inspiration and warning. It shows us how dramatically life can respond to changing conditions, how quickly ecosystems can be transformed, and how the atmosphere we take for granted is actually a dynamic system that has undergone radical changes throughout Earth's history. The study of Carboniferous gigantism also provides crucial insights into the fundamental limits of biological design and the factors that constrain or enable evolutionary innovation. Understanding how these ancient giants achieved their extraordinary sizes helps us better understand the physical and physiological principles that govern life on Earth. The world of 35% oxygen and giant arthropods is gone forever, but its lessons about the relationship between atmosphere and life, the creativity of evolution, and the dynamic nature of our planet remain as relevant as ever. In studying these ancient giants, we learn not just about the past, but about the possibilities and perils that await us in the future. The extinction of the Carboniferous giants marks not just the end of a particular group of organisms, but the close of an entire chapter in Earth's biological history. A chapter that will never be repeated, but whose influence continues to shape our world in ways both seen and unseen. Their story reminds us that our planet is capable of supporting forms of life that seem impossible today, and that the conditions we consider normal are just one point on a vast spectrum of possibilities that Earth has explored throughout its long history. As we return from our journey to the oxygen-drunk world of the Carboniferous period, we're left with a profound appreciation for just how extraordinary that time was in Earth's history. For 60 million years longer than the entire age of mammals, our planet supported atmospheric oxygen levels that enabled life forms so spectacular they challenge our imagination and redefine our understanding of what's possible in biology. The giants of the Carboniferous world weren't just bigger versions of modern animals. They were the products of a unique set of environmental conditions that has never been repeated in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. The 35% oxygen atmosphere, the warm global climate, the vast lignin-rich forests, and the absence of large vertebrate competitors created a perfect storm for arthropod evolution that produced creatures unlike anything before or since. Meganeura, with its 70-centimeter wingspan, patrolled skies that belonged entirely to insects for over 100 million years. Arthropleura, longer than most modern cars, crawled through forests of scale trees that reached heights rivaling modern skyscrapers. These weren't aberrations or evolutionary mistakes. They were perfectly adapted organisms, thriving in an atmosphere that had been fundamentally transformed by the interplay of plant, evolution, and geological accident. The story of the Carboniferous period teaches us several crucial lessons about our planet and our place on it. First, it demonstrates just how dynamic Earth's atmosphere has been throughout its history. The air we breathe today, which seems so stable and permanent, is actually the product of billions of years of evolution and environmental change. The oxygen levels we consider normal are just one point on a spectrum that has ranged from nearly 0 to 35% throughout Earth's history. Second, the Carboniferous period shows us how profoundly atmospheric changes can influence evolution and ecosystem structure. The rise to 35% oxygen didn't just allow existing organisms to grow larger. It fundamentally altered what was possible for life on Earth, enabling evolutionary experiments that would be impossible under any other conditions. Finally, the Carboniferous world reminds us that the creatures sharing our planet today represent just a tiny fraction of the forms that life has taken throughout Earth's history. For tens of millions of years, our world was dominated by arthropods so large and spectacular that they seem like fantasy creatures from our perspective. Not as we face our own era of rapid atmospheric change. The lessons of the Carboniferous period are more relevant than ever. We're conducting our own atmospheric experiment, adding carbon to the air at rates not seen for millions of years. The Carboniferous period shows us that such changes can have profound, long-lasting effects on life. Itself effects that can take millions of years to fully unfold. The age of 35% oxygen is gone forever, but its legacy lives on in the coal deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution and in the fossil record that preserves the memory of Earth's most extraordinary atmospheric experiment. The giants may be extinct, but their story continues to teach us about the incredible creativity of evolution and the dynamic nature of the planet we call home.